Welcome back to Adelaide. I'm Pete Nichols, CEO of Parents Beyond Breakup. Given that we have an international audience, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you for joining us from wherever you are around the globe, especially to our Kiwi friends who submitted questions earlier. With me today, I have Sarah Game, and I'm going to ask Sarah to introduce herself.
Thank you so much. I'm Sarah Game. I'm actually a member of the South Australian Parliament. So I've got a party called Fair Go for Australians. If you're interested, we're the only party, I think, that's actually advocating for alienated parents and recognises parental alienation at the moment. And I'm a mum of 3 kids. And before Parliament, I was a veterinarian, and I've also been a school teacher.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. We're going to be asking Sarah the same 4 questions we have to all of our guests across different areas of expertise. Sarah obviously comes at it from a political perspective. So we get very different answers depending on what people's background and experience is. So without further ado, let me kick into the first of the 4 key questions. From your perspective, Sarah, what is parental alienation?
What I want to say as well is that the way I came across parental alienation, which leads me to my understanding of parental alienation, when I got into Parliament, I'd never heard of parental alienation. What I just wanted to do was advocate for the community, find those areas where there was a need. And so there were a couple of areas that just took off for me on my social media. I guess that's the way you get out when the mainstream media aren't interested. And so when I did a speech on men's health, it absolutely went off. So I had hundreds of thousands of views. We had lots of letters, thank you so much for talking about men's health. And by the way, parental alienation doesn't just affect men. But when I did a speech on men's health, it went absolutely off. And from that, I started being contacted by people about other issues, and parental alienation was one of them. And that's how I got introduced to the concept of parental alienation. Some of them were grandparents, some of them were women, and a lot of them were men. I mean, the research that we've looked at, a lot of the research says it's 50-50. Our experience in terms of men and women being equally affected by parental alienation. I mean, I'm not, the research expert, but that's what I've looked at. But our office and my community interactions, it's predominantly been men that have rung the office, but some women and grandparents as well. When you say, well, what is parental alienation? I'm really clear on what it's not, and I want to be clear about that as well. What I've found is in the Parliament, if I raise the concept of parental alienation, immediately what's said to me is, oh, you're advocating for domestically violent fathers to be able to abuse their partners and children. And it doesn't matter really, it doesn't seem to matter what I say, because I say, no, that's not what I said. What I'm talking about is good parents, who found themselves estranged from their children and families for reasons that aren't justifiable. But I found in the Parliament that's immediately twisted to sort of an advocacy for a really bad, violent person, and stories are brought up about, those really serious cases, someone's died or, been murdered and so on. And that's got nothing to, that's not what we're talking about. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about parental alienation. So when you say, what is parental alienation? It's not that. It's not advocating for a really destructive man or woman, to come in and destroy their partner and children's lives. We're talking about good parents or good enough parents, because that's what I can speak authoritatively on. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert on legal matters relating to parental alienation, but I'm a parent of 3 kids. It's advocating for good enough parents. You can only be a good enough parent. It's advocating for good enough parents and the children of good enough parents, to have a good relationship with each other. And so when you say, well, what is parental alienation? I think it's when you see a child not want to spend time with a good enough parent. I mean, children are wired to want to be connected to their parents. So you find, and that was something that's been raised with me, is that even in situations where you've got an abusive parent, kids normally want to spend time with that parent. Okay, that's just a biological instinct that they want to be close to that parent. And I think you've got to be thinking there's an alarm bell that parental alienation might be occurring when you've got a child that doesn't want to spend time with the other parent, because the natural inclination is to want to bond with that parent. So for me, long answer, but parental alienation, it's got nothing to do with serious criminal, domestic abuse. That's not what we're talking about. That shouldn't be brought into the conversation every time parental alienation is raised. Parental alienation is when you've got a breakdown unjustifiably between a child and a good enough parent, because none of us are perfect parents, okay? So we're good enough parents. And it's often, well, I would say it's often a deliberate action by one of the other parents or their family, to alienate and break down that bond. And that can look quite, I mean, when I was reading through the literature, a lot of it's really extreme. This person's been kidnapped, or it could be, actually ceasing contact completely. But it can be much more insidious than that. It could be people playing victim. If a child is watching a parent always crying and being very distraught every time they're interacting with another parent, it would be natural for that child to feel negatively towards that other parent, and to feel protective towards the parent that's displaying those distress signals, for example. So I think parental alienation can be really overt, where you actually kidnap a child and move to another country. But it can be really covert and insidious and hard to pin down, and like subtle behaviors, crying, playing victim, not wanting to acknowledge, the other parent in the home, or have photographs or, pictures up. So when you ask me what is parental alienation, it's complex. And I just wanted to make that distinction at the beginning, that it's not about advocating for these sort of minority, extreme cases that we've read about in the media. It's about making sure good enough parents and their children have the relationship that's needed for both of their well-beings.
Yeah. Well, look, I think you've touched upon, you've used the words unwarranted earlier, I believe, or unjustified. And I think it kind of already leads me to think about what your position might be. But rather than me guessing, what is your position on parental alienation formally, and why?
Well, it definitely exists. So there's no question about it existing. The only place really that I have discovered as a politician that parental alienation doesn't exist acknowledged is in the parliament. So that's one of the things that needs to be changed. If you go out and speak in the community, everybody will acknowledge that there's parental alienation that I've spoken to. They've either experienced it themselves, or they know somebody who's experienced it. So I haven't encountered really anyone in the community. I'm not saying there's no one out there, but I speak to a lot of people who doesn't recognize that parental alienation is a real phenomena. It's not acknowledged by politicians or parliamentarians as a real phenomena, not in the South Australian Parliament. I know that for a fact because I've put up motions and I've spoken to my colleagues, and it's dismissed. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to get changed. But it's absolutely a real thing. I mean, I won't give names, but I know friends who've gone through parental alienation, or rather parental alienating behaviors. So maybe they haven't been alienated completely from their child yet, but the behaviors are there. One that sticks out, and obviously, keep the details private, was a dear friend that I had, really great person. You don't have to have all this going for you to be a good parent, by the way. I've certainly been broke and had no money in my life, but he had a great job, or has a great job, earns really well, a beautiful home, just a really stable, nice person. And he had this a baby with this lady, and she decided that that baby was going to have her last name only, not his last name. They weren't together. And then he said, "Oh, I want to at least have a hyphen name." And I actually saw the letters for myself, because I never believed one side of the story. And I saw the letters, and she'd actually said, there were legal letters where she'd actually said, no, if we have a hyphen name, this baby, who I think was 3 months old, at the time, this baby is going to be damaged. They're used to people waving and saying, hello, baby so-and-so, right? Now, if we hyphen the name, this was a 3-month-old, the baby's going to be traumatized by that. I thought, oh my goodness me, this was the first inclination that there was really some mental illness going on, possibly with this other person. This friend of mine, who I'd known for years, totally stable, had no addictions. She would make him use a breathalyzer, before she would go and visit, before he would go and visit the child. And he never visited. That child's a few years old now, but I don't think he's ever seen that child without her presence and taking a breathalyzer test. And so there's been all this extreme, what I'd call alienating behaviors. Now, they're not completely alienated at this point, but I guess that's worth highlighting, is that the behaviors can be there before, that's separate from the actual alienation, isn't it? Yep. So position on parental alienation, the research is there that it exists. But more importantly, the anecdotes are there that it exists, the stories from the community. That's my job as a politician, is to try and listen to people in the community and understand what's a hot topic, what are people interested in. Sometimes I touch on something, I think that's really interesting for the community. No one cares about it. Okay, move on. Parental alienation isn't one of those topics. Parental alienation is one of those topics where we get hundreds of letters, we get lots of phone calls, we get lots of emails. It's a real issue in the community. That's what I've heard on a big scale. But as I say, I also know personally people that have suffered from parental alienation.
Okay. Well, something you said there was quite interesting as well, because our experience is that the best thing that I guess one of the best things that we've learned from talking to so many different experts around Australia and internationally is that we've discovered that the parental alienation is on spectrum from behaviors through to full-blown cases of it. And so many experts that we talk to in the court system tend to look at the extreme end only and don't understand or have ways of looking at the earlier stage where the behaviors are on their way.
Yes.
And then that can't be handled because it's not full-blown. So really interesting point, actually, that you brought up there. Just in terms of our first 4 questions that we ask of all of our guests, what do you think the changes need to be and why? What do we need to change from your perspective as a politician or from the people that you've spoken to?
So coming from a political perspective, so obviously I'm not, in that psychology or legal, that's not my predominant focus, but from a political perspective, we need, step 1 is parental alienation needs to be acknowledged by politicians, as a real thing that's happening out there. And so that involves a process. I mean, I could read it out, we have time later, but I've got a motion before the Parliament asking our politicians to recognise this as a real phenomena that actually happens, because when you have a political group or system that doesn't recognise it at all, then you're not going to have any of the legal changes or other changes, towards it, because they're not even recognising it as a real issue. So step 1 is let's recognise it in the Parliament of South Australia. I'd love to bring that motion to a vote. So that's what you do, sort of put forward your idea and then you vote on it. I know at the moment we don't have the numbers for that and that it will collapse because the Labor Party has a position against recognising parental alienation as a significant problem in the community at the moment. That might change. I'm not saying that's true of every individual Labor member, but that's their overall position in terms of voting on it at the moment. That needs to change. The other thing that I've asked for, I've looked into trying to obviously create legislation, to actually say, to create a change legislatively to combat parental alienation. That is tricky. That's so tricky because it's so pervasive, it's insidious. How do you prove it? How do you criminalize this? The position I came to with that was, I, Sarah Game, am not going to single-handedly come up with this answer. And so the things that I asked for to move that forward, 1, I asked our Attorney General to refer this idea to the South Australian Law Reform Institute. So they're an institute that does, research into law reform. So these tricky areas, they've got the resources, they've got the people to say, hang on, this is an area we need to be looking into. How do we actually, create change in this area? The only person that can refer this issue to the South Australian Law Reform Institute, my understanding is the Attorney General. I've asked him to do that. He said no. So the next thing I've done is create a piece of legislation that in a way doesn't do much, but in a way does a lot. And it's more an inquiry. Okay, so it's trying to get up an inquiry to say, hey, look, in South Australia, we need to have an inquiry into this. And that would mean that a number of politicians, upper and lower house, have to give their time to hear from witnesses and submissions. And that would get, lawyers in, social workers in, psychologists in, the public in, people's personal stories to say, okay, look, this is what's actually happening. We're having an inquiry. It's like a mini Royal Commission. And then out of that would come recommendations. So I think there needs to be legal changes in terms of the specific way we're going to conduct those legal changes. I think there's steps before that. I think it requires a level of research beyond, one member. And I think it requires probably an inquiry to get a better handle on a whole lot of professionals' point of view. Something simple that I thought of, I say simple, was I personally believe that at the point of breakdown of the relationship, when whether it be a divorce or a separation, it really should be mandatory for both parties to be have some level of education. At the moment you can just separate and, divorce. When I'm divorced myself, we didn't have to get any education about anything. you should have to get some sort of mandatory education about the importance of fostering a relationship with both parents for the child and the damages that can cause. Because I think sometimes people don't know that. You can be a really bad partner. This is what people don't sort of, and still a good enough parent. And a good enough parent is essential for that child. That's not diminishing the role of that parent because they're a good enough parent. I'm only a good enough parent. I try my absolute best. I'm a good enough parent. I make a lot of mistakes. Every parent does. I've got 3 kids. I've got a job. We all make mistakes. So the good enough parent needs to have a relationship with that child. Yeah.
Okay, actually, that's really interesting, Sarah, because I think out of all of the guests we've had, not one person has yet said we need to get parliamentary, whether it's state or federal, recognition of the issue. But it's actually obvious when you stop and think about it that you do.
Yes.
And so then I'm led to think, well, what is the mechanism to do that? And I think you've touched upon it. That's really interesting, and that will probably feed into the policy framework that we're looking at. How do we bring around change in Australia? Look, the final question, and we're kind of running on time a little bit. From a practical sense, from your perspective, what is it that those who are going through this right now, parents, grandparents, maybe adult kids, what can they do about this? Is there anything that you can think of or you can suggest?
Look, and I hate, first of all, so I'm not alienated from my kids, but if I was alienated from my kids, I wouldn't be coping very well. So I hate to purport to be someone that would give, I will try and give some advice, but, I don't come from a place of knowing that. But what I do know is that if someone tried to alienate me from my kids, I think that would create some very extreme emotions and it could create some very extreme behavior. And I'm sure that fulfills the problem, that sort of keeps the cycle going. So I think if you've been alienated from your child or you're dealing with someone who has, you're encouraging them to, I think there can be forgiveness of your own self and realizing that that's not you, because there's going to be things where you look back and go, oh, I did that wrong, or I did that wrong, or this wasn't right. We've all done it. We're talking, I can't stress enough the good enough parent. If you're a good enough parent, you should be having a relationship with your child, and your child deserves to be having a relationship with you. So I think people need to have forgiveness for themselves if they find themselves in that situation. We need to have formal acknowledgement, of the situation in Parliament and in the community. I think the community acknowledges it, but I think it's hard to talk about. I think there's a level of shame possibly with talking about it because it's also not actually formally acknowledged as a real issue. If you want to do something about it, for me, I mean, obviously people need support and they need to reach out to the various organisations that can support them. We know that being alienated from your child is a major risk factor for mental health and well-being, not just for the parent that's alienated, but for the child ultimately. I mean, it's a mental health issue. The simplest thing I can see would be, be writing to your politicians. You should be writing to your local member. This is a real issue, and making sure they're aware that this is a real issue. Because lots of people write to me, but somehow the Parliament of South Australia seems to think this is not a real issue. And obviously, perhaps biasly, I would say, next election, vote for a party that's actually recognises parental alienation. I mean, I recognise parental alienation. We've got legislation to go. I want to get another member into Parliament. It's all about numbers. So in terms of getting up an inquiry, it's all about numbers and getting that numbers of support.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. And actually, look, I'm conscious that you probably do need to go in about 10 minutes. So we probably just rattle through a few of the questions. We're getting quite a few of them actually here. You've already started talking about it to some extent, so let me just expand it a little bit with a particular question. It's from a professional, an online professional in Australia, and they're saying, Sarah, what will it take to criminalise and recognise parental alienation as a form of abuse towards kids and targeted adults?
So, well, that's really going to be hard to answer, except that it reminds me that I wanted to say that alienating a child from a good enough parent is definitely a form of child abuse. I mean, that is child abuse. You're creating a long-term, mental health issue. You're predisposing that child to depression, anxiety, not feeling confident, lowering their self-esteem. That is absolutely child abuse. I do think that some sort of awareness campaign and understanding that, hey, if you're a parent alienating your child from a good enough parent, then, there can be repercussions. You could have your child removed from you and you could be charged in future. I do think some sort of campaign like that would be helpful. The problem with all of these types of things and why I'm hesitant about it is they can be misused. It's like, we just had legislation passed in the Parliament about coercive control. Now, I didn't support that legislation. I think I was the only member who didn't support that legislation, and was two reasons why I didn't really support it. I mean, one was heavily gendered language. You know, it was clearly defined as men coercively controlling women, and we know that both men and women can be abusive. And so that didn't sit well. But also, I was really worried about that piece of legislation being misused to actually alienate good enough parents. You know, that someone could actually claim, "Hey, that person's coercively controlling; they can't be around me." It wasn't clear enough to me that we could really pinpoint it. So how do we criminalize that? We want to criminalize it, absolutely. It should be an offence to alienate your child from a good enough parent. The road to that is vote in the right politicians, write to your member, get up an inquiry, let's get the legislation, inquiry underway, and let's get the recommendations and form a piece of legislation that can't be misused.
Okay. All right. So let's rattle through some of these as quickly as we can.
Sorry.
No.
Answers.
No. But you're actually giving us the information that we've not heard from anyone else. So thank you. This is actually really good stuff. And actually, just to touch upon that, the domestic violence side of things, one of the questions, and it's from a professional here in the room in Adelaide, so thank you. What makes gendered domestic violence advocates frightened of the issue of parental alienation, do you think?
What makes them
frightened?
Not an easy
question.
Well, yeah, what makes them frightened? And are they really frightened? Look, I do think that, so I've done a lot of men's health and men's advocacy. And like I said, actually, parental alienation affects women, it affects men, it affects grandparents, it affects everyone. Our experience in the office is it predominantly affects men. The literature says often it's 50-50. But in terms of the fear that comes from it, I do think that it's part of the wider narrative, men are the abusers, men commit the acts of domestic violence, even though we know actually a lot of men are subject to domestic violence themselves. And I think there's a fear, I don't know about their professionals, but there's a fear amongst politicians. I believe there's a fear amongst politicians that if they were to be seen to stand up and say, "Hey, this kid's being alienated from their parents. We're not going to stand for this anymore. We're going to do this inquiry. We're going to look into it." There's a fear there that they're going to be linked back to this, you support domestically violent fathers. What about this case? This guy, hunted down this woman and he, burnt everyone alive. Is that what you're supporting? No, that's not what we're supporting. That's not what we're supporting. But that's the fear, because you can't have a conversation without that happening. If anyone wants to look me up, Sarah Game, and have a look at the videos I've asked in the Parliament about parental alienation, if I ask a question about parental alienation, the answer always involves something about domestic violence. And am I supporting domestic violence? You can't have separate conversation.
Sure. And actually, just on that topic, we have another question here from a professional online. Since we already have coercive control laws, why can't lawyers use the law to punish alienation for gatekeeping or withholding kids? Now, you can't answer it from a legal point of view, but do you have a perspective on why the law can't extend to this kind of subject?
Well, I've got thoughts on that, which are, I've spoken to a lot of lawyers and I get different answers, by the way. So some lawyers tell me, look, if there's a dad being alienated from their kid, there absolutely is a legal remedy for them and they can do it, and the law provides for that, and they can. I've spoken to lawyers who tell me that. And then I've absolutely spoken to lawyers who tell me, no, you can't. So, so that's tricky. I think that it's very difficult to prove, isn't it? It's very difficult to prove. It's happening in somebody else's home. It can be quite insidious. Like I said, it doesn't have to be that overt kind of behavior. It can be little small behaviors that are accumulating over time to make a child not want to spend time with the other parent. It does remind me that I want to say that I have met dads that have absolutely been alienated from their children. They don't realize they've been alienated from their children because they don't realize, I think there's a lack of, not always, but often the father's the one out sort of working, providing the breadwinner role, right? Especially when the child is small, okay, and the woman is the primary caregiver. That's not always the case, but that's often the case. If you're the primary caregiver, you've got an advantage, obviously, to abuse these types of behaviours because your bond is going to be a little bit stronger with that child, at least initially. You're the one that's been spending the time with the child. I'm not saying they're more important. They're not more important. Someone's got to go out and earn the money. And this is obviously very traditional. This is not everyone's family, but it's a lot of families. And a lot of families, especially around that birth, the man's been out, earning the money. The female's been at home. So the primary caregiver has got that ability to abuse that power, okay, that they've got that stronger connection. and it can be very insidious. How do you pinpoint those types of behaviors? That's why I think we have to be careful. I think it's a combination of laying the law down and saying, hey, if we can prove this about you, you're going to be punished for it. And that might have a level of deterrence. You can be punished for it. But it's a level of prevention as well, and saying to separated parents, listen, you're going to harm your child. If you don't foster a good relationship with the other parent, your child is at greater risk of depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, not growing up happy, and trying to appeal to that aspect as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so actually we've had a couple, and again, I'm just conscious of time here. We have a question here from, hasn't Natasha Stott-Despoja, if I pronounced that correctly, just done the very inquiry that you were talking about? Shouldn't there be some action from that submission? Any thoughts on that?
She definitely hasn't done the inquiry that I've been talking about. I mean, they don't even recognise parental alienation. So I think, it's to do with, domestic violence and all that. But there's no recognition about, parental alienation, is my understanding, in this state formally. So they're not looking into that. No one's looking into that.
Okay. All right. That's interesting to know, actually. So, yeah, we do need to look at something new by the looks of it then. Very specific. Here we go. We've got a question here. It's from the room. Education may not work when an alienator has mental health issues. Preventing mediation. How do we change the police action around false allegations to facilitate alienation? How do we change the police action? Sorry, it's the way it's written. No. I couldn't quite understand, but how do we change how the police act in order to stop false allegations facilitating alienation?
So, look, firstly, just reminds me of some of the research. I'm an expert on the research, but the research says, primary cause of actually alienating a kid is revenge. That's number one. Number two is that parent has a mental health issue, so that's what's raised here. So that's another really common cause, is that parent has some sort of undiagnosed mental health issue that's leading them to behave in that way to alienate that child. Certainly, my understanding is that changes have happened to defamation laws recently as well to make it easier to make false allegations, so you can actually make false, malicious allegations about domestic abuse and not sort of be so worried about any, come back to yourself. And that was designed to, I guess, make women, predominantly, help women feel less afraid about making allegations. Changing police mentality, I think that stems back to that original, when you've got politicians in a parliament that stand up and say there's parental alienating behaviours, we're doing an inquiry, we don't stand for it. We've got a situation where we've got a problem with people making false allegations, they're abusing laws that are there existing, to alienate parents. I think that flows down onto police. I think that's got to be a recommendation that's got to come out of an inquiry. I don't think you're going to get change otherwise.
Okay, well, look, thank you so much for that, sir. Look, I think we're going to draw a line in the sand now because you do need to get away.
Yes,
Sarah, thank you so much for spending the time. You're the first and only politician that has been brave enough to come up here and talk about this subject, so I appreciate that. So a couple of things quickly to say. The next one of these ANZPAC monthly conferences is going to come to you from Auckland on September the 17th in New Zealand. So for the Kiwis watching, I know we have some because of the earlier question. We'll be there with you in New Zealand next month. Outside of that, thank you very much for joining us today here in the room in Adelaide and online, wherever you happen to be. And we look forward to catching up next time with our next two experts. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for coming.